David Stovall, our keynote speaker this year, comes to us from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is a professor. All right, go Illinois, Chicago, go Cubs, right? Professor of Educational Policy Studies and African American Studies. His research includes critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, the relationship between schools and community stakeholders, and of course, social justice education. I'm amazed by everything David does. I did a little research to find out what that was, and then I met him. In order to do all that, David has stretched his own searching and his understanding to include studies in educational policy analysis, sociology, urban planning, political science, community organizing, and youth culture. That's not even the best. The best part, to me anyway, is that with a collective of college professors in California, Arizona, and New York, they teach high school courses to provide historically underserved schools with college access and credit. Yes, he volunteers to be a high school social studies teacher. Yes, his students create the curriculum. It is so awesome. That's not even the best yet. Listen to his students. This is the best class, the best teacher I've ever had. He is amazing, smartest teacher I've had so far. Another one. Professor Stovall is the best professor at UIC. You will never get bored attending lectures. So let's not get bored and give it up for David Stovall.
Hey, what's happening, y'all? Let me first do a couple of thank yous, right? The first is I want to recognize the indigenous First Nations people on land who which we rest, right? This must be, and these are the nations recognized and unrecognized by the federal government, because the federal government cannot regulate indigeneity and home, right? So I must be thankful for those souls who have passed on so that I'm here, right? The second, I want to make sure I thank the folks from the Northwest Teachers for Social Justice piece for getting me out here, because I'm used to being uninvited to things, right? So, and based on my comments today, you all will see why, right? And so Wayne, Al, Linda Christensen, Bill Bigelow, Dan and Ian for taking care of me this morning, getting me situated. That means a lot, because these types of things, these gatherings are part of a larger movement that is happening across the country, right? And these things we need to pay attention to, right? I'm looking at you. I don't know if some of you all saw this. I took a picture of you all, right? So I could come back to my high schoolers, because my high schoolers always say, Stovall, you ain't do that, right? So I had to take a picture, like, look, it's all, so I might have to like selfie y'all, right? So just to show what actually is happening. And there are a couple of names that I want to say explicitly, because these are the folks who are doing the work that go unrecognized, right? And I got a chance to read about them this summer, because there's some things that happened here in Seattle that are parallel to what's been happening to Chicago. So in Chicago, we've had this rash of school closings. And you all had a rash of school closings, particularly with a group of young people that have been historically underserved. Those are the young folks in the middle college system, right? So if they are here today, I want to personally recognize Rogelio Rigor, and to make sure that I say his name correctly, Alonzo Ibarra, right? So I want to make sure that I say their names, because in the recognition of their names, these are the programs that become critically important to making sure that young folks get what they need, because historically in the history of the United States, young folks have not, right? So we got to start with that as teachers. We have to start with that as folks who have critical consciousness. And I want to make sure that I shout out the good homie, Veronica Velez at Western Washington University, and the young bloods who came from Western Washington, right? Because the work that because I want to recognize that you all are in a hostile and violent space. right? And in those hostile and violent spaces, resistance becomes critical, right? But not resistance in the reactionary sense, but resistance to build, right? Because if we don't have that resistance, then we get more of the same. So thank you all for doing this work, right? Now, lastly, 2 young women who got berated in the national media, but I'm going to say their names and I'm going to do it right? So I want to make sure I recognize Marissa Johnson and Mara Jacqueline Williford, right? Because we, in the campaign of Say Her Name, is about black deaths of black women and transgender women, but I want to say their names because they said something about y'all that y'all don't like, and when they interrupted Bernie Sanders. So when the folks started booing them, they said, thank you for reminding us of how racist a city Seattle is, right? So in that space, I want to be clear around what it is that I try to do, what I'm recognizing that's happening here, that's happening across the country. So the Seattle Teachers Union, I want to thank y'all too, right? For having some courage, right? Because if we don't have that courage, if we don't have that courage to say that good working conditions are good teaching conditions, we get more of the same, right? And then a couple years back, a couple of the homies at Garfield High got rid of some standardized tests, right? So I want to thank y'all for that because, again, that's huge, right? Because this type of work goes underappreciated, right? And recognizing the grind that is teaching and how teaching goes so unsupported, we also need to make that claim, right? But we also need to have a critique of that claim, right? So let me see, by a show of hands and clapping, where are the 20-year veterans in teaching? Thank y'all. Yep. Yeah, because that's the type of stuff, because you all are the purveyors of truth, right? When you able to stick around that long, hey, you believe in what you do, right? And what about the 10-year veterans, right? Yeah, that's what's up. Now, and one more thing. Can all the first-year teachers please stand? Hey, now, I got a challenge. I got a challenge for y'all. No, stay standing, because I want y'all to hear this one, right? I got a challenge for y'all. Look, I want to see y'all in 5 years, right? That's the piece, because the national data says that the majority of y'all leave in year 1, right? So I want y'all to stay, right? And now everybody else who's seated, it's our job to support them in staying, right? Let's be clear, right? Thank y'all. Now, I saw a group of young people who had on some purple shirts that said, Washington recruiting teachers. Where those young bloods? Hey, look, I'm going to find y'all at the end of the day, because we need to wrap, because that's the first time I done seen that many people of color with teaching shirts on. So whoever's doing that work, I want to recognize y'all, right? Right? Now, let's get into the stuff that y'all don't. I've heard this term across the country, right? So in Minnesota, they call it Minnesota nice, right? So they had this thing called, in the Northwest, I've heard it called Seattle nice, or Northwest or Pacific Northwest nice, right? What is that really? That is passive aggressive behavior, right? And we got to name it for what it is, right? Because in this day and age, the idea, and we see all the folks on television talking crazy about we need to get beyond race. So every time I hear that shit, again, let me apologize. My English language is limited, so I curse a lot, right? So every time I hear that, right, I have to be clear around what that is. That is a further attempt to dehumanize and obfuscate the issue. We can't get past race because we ain't never dealt with race, right? So now, when we're talking about racism, we need to reframe some of the things that we're doing. Now, I'm from Chicago. Now, some of y'all might be Cubs fans. That's another story, right? Because I'm a South Sider and we got a thing about that, right? So this thing around looking at what's been happening in Chicago, because the national rhetoric around Chicago is this place is a hyper-violent place. You know, we got all these young folks who are engaged in some forms of violence. I want to reframe that for you all. I want to reframe that because this thing is happening in a very particular way, right? So we're not talking about hyper-violent young people, right? So, but again, the data will ask us to ask a different question. So 2 weeks ago, 15 people were shot in 14 hours, right? From July 1st to July 8th, there were 336 people shot with 69 homicides. Now, if we map those homicides, they happen in certain parts of the city. But I want to change our framing about this, and I want to understand, and let's put it out in the street. We have to get away from understanding racism solely as individualized acts of bigotry. We have to understand racism systemically, right? So if we understand racism systemically, I live in a hyper-segregated city, one of the most segregated cities in the world, right? And in those cities, you are not affiliated, and see, that's the national rhetoric. That's Fox News getting y'all scared to come to Chicago, right? No, in Chicago, no, there's these imminent gang tensions. No, the tension is in hyper-segregation, because if you've never seen a space outside of your particular community, anyone who encroaches on that community actually is a potential threat. Now, they do this here in Washington State, they just don't say it, right? So what if I split the room in half, right? You all are one school, you all the other. You get closed and have to go to the new school. What happens on the first day? Hella fights, right? And what is it? And what's it fueled by? It's fueled by this sense of, I don't like them over there, right? That could be the rival school. Now, do that 200 times since 2004 and do it 50 times in one summer. Now, we're not talking about hyper-violent youth. We're talking about a situation that is an extension of the colonial project and slavery that continues to create open-air cages for those who have been deemed disposable to kill themselves in. Right? Now, if we think about that from a different perspective, it changes up what it is that we're seeing. Right? And I'm concerned about this across the country because in all these spaces, we get all this thing around, well, we just don't know what to do. That is the worst thing you can say, right? We just don't know what to do. And then y'all got all these ways to name people of color, right? We have urban youth. Who are we talking about? Now that kills me. You know, I teach in an urban school. Yeah? For real? Who goes to that school? Right? And why is it such, and this thing around this niceness prevents us from getting to the issue, right? And when we're so nice that we can't talk about the issue, our students reject us, right? Because your students are just like, yeah, content means nothing, right? The relationship, because these are young folks who are in a situation that may be devoid of love. How do you fill those spaces with love? Right? So let's get down to the root of this. Now, I'm going to take a quote from folks like David Tyak and James Anderson and Vanessa Siddle Walker and Amanda LaShaw, who say this thing that we rarely engage. And I'm going to say it, and again, if I get uninvited, I understand. Right? The American K-12 schooling system was never intended to educate the American populace. All right? Let's be clear. Right? Now, what I'm doing, I'm making a very explicit delineation between education and schooling. Now, I always ask my high schoolers, and you know, y'all can deliver your prayers and good energy for me. I got high schoolers, I got seniors, 8th period. Right? So your shit better be good. If you got 17 and 18-year-olds that are thinking about everything else in 8th period. Oh, man, she like me. Oh, she like me. Right? Or when it's sunny outside, it's like, oh, it's sunny outside. Damn. You know, I feel like I should be running in the grass, right? Right? So this thing around, so if we understand that it was never intended to educate folks, then I hope this room is filled with rabble-rousers. Right? I hope this room is filled with folks who are engaged in a radical sensibility around what that means. Right? Because I believe James Loewen, right? History was intended to be boring because you don't pay attention to the stuff that's really happening to you. Right? So if I can make it boring as hell, then why would I be compelled to pay attention to the things that actually are key to my life? Right? And we start with the bullshit Columbus story. Right? Look, let's talk about it how it is. You know, you got the babies, and some of y'all think it's cute. You got the babies singing a bogus song about the dude who we don't even know what he looked like, went the wrong way. Ferdinand and Isabel pawned the jewelry. Then he goes the wrong way, lands, comes back 3 times, names folk the wrong name, then sends the rest of his homies to bring death and destruction. Now, if you begin the Columbus story with that with your kindergartners, I got love for you. Right? Right? Because one of my homies, Heather Duncan in Chicago, she tells her kindergartners the real Columbus story, and every time on Columbus Day or stuff around that, all they do is look and say, he ain't right. Right? And what does she use to teach? What does she use to teach that? Beans. All right? Gives all the young folks beans. And she says, yeah, well, those are your beans, right? They're mine now. I'm discovering them. In fact, I'm going to discover them and I'm going to eat them. Right? And they're like, man, what are you doing? Right? That's like, I'm discovering now. Did I discover your beans? No. Right? I always like little ones because their bullshit meter is off. Right? They like, no. Right? You ain't discovered nothing. You took my stuff. Right? And because of that, then she says, all right, well, that's what they saying that this dude did. People already here. Right? And you discovered something. What have you discovered? Right? And if we think about that extension of manifest destiny, right? Or let's name it what it is. A few white folks manifest destiny. Right? Then we have to pay attention to something else. And this is where it gets a little more tragic. And I want us to think about the things that are happening in places like New Orleans. So when the hurricane hit in 2010, from August to November, remember, all New Orleans teachers from August to November of 2010 were summarily fired, right? Without contract, void of any due process. Of those 7,500 teachers that were fired, 4,000 were black women. It was the largest single firing of black women in the history of the United States. Now, if we think about that in a different way, so what happens to New Orleans, they break up this thing called Act 35, actually makes a process that they can break up their school district into 43 charter networks that are not geographically located, right? And some of those charter networks have particular policies, like silent lunches for first graders. Right? Now, If you want to engage in torture of a young person, put them in a silent lunch. Now, there are other schools that will not begin instruction unless young people are in the frisk position. Right? Hands down, forward. Now, you are also directed to walk on lines with your hands behind your back. Now, these aren't the high schoolers, these are the babies. So if you have a school system that asks young folks to engage in dehumanizing behavior every day, what are you telling those young folks about their own self-worth? Now, there's a historian named Saidiya Hartman who has a very harrowing take on this, and I believe her. She says that we should understand these things as the afterlife of slavery. Right? You are reminding those young people that they are captive and they will be punished for anything that comes out of their way. Right? And these are little ones. Right? So I'm in there and I'm so incensed. I'm like, man, look, they're about to call a SWAT team on me. Right? But this thing around how this plays itself out, right? We want to pay attention to that because here in Seattle, y'all got half of y'all, less than 5% of your population is black, but it accounts for almost 30% of the folks who are incarcerated. Right? So again, that's just the data, not Stovall's conjecture. Right? But the other thing around school, and I want to understand our schools as places that are potentially hostile and violent. And I want to interrupt the concept of a school to prison pipeline. I want us to think about a school and prison nexus. So the school and prison aren't things that you travel to, they are the same thing. So if they're the same thing, and you got disciplinary strategies that read in the data the same way, black, brown, Pacific Islander, indigenous young folks, always suspended and expelled, with a majority white teaching force, we got a disconnect. And that's been happening in Seattle for the last 60 years. Again, I told y'all wasn't gonna like it. But at the same time, what are the things, what is redress? What is the space? So Patrick Kamiyan always says, we got young folks who are dealing with dispossession. There's been something taken from them, their humanity and knowledge of self. What do we do intentionally to get their shit back? And how is it reflected in the day-to-day, right? And I say this as a struggling high school social studies teacher, right? Because see, the professor thing, that's easy, right? You go, do class, say something crazy. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, get in front of a group of young folks who do not care that you have a PhD. Right? Like, what you gonna do now, homie? Right? And I find myself apologizing perpetually to them. Right? It's like, man, yesterday, that sucked. I've got to do better. And because I have to do better, what are these things that you're up against? A lot of you all already are in trouble with your administration. Right? And I won't end. Right? And if we think about our experiences with good teachers, and our K-12 experience, the teacher that we loved was always in trouble. Right? There's no escape from that. So if that's the truth, then how do we actually create a space where we're actually informing troublemakers? Right? Hellraisers. Right? Because this type of space, if we get more of the same, and I'll just use Chicago as a reference, if we get more of the same, I live in a state that is so broke, right? This is always a thing nationally, right? Everybody wants to claim that they're 48th in educational spending. It's the weirdest thing. Like I've been to at least 40 states, and they've claimed that they're 48th in educational spending, right? So you go to the Washington legislature, I can guarantee you're gonna say we 48th, right? So what that's really telling us that we don't know anything about who's in what level of brokenness that we're in. But here's how broke the state of Illinois is. We don't have a budget and have not had a budget since June 30th. If you won the lottery in the state of Illinois, they could only pay you $600. I heard it on CNN yesterday, right? So we're so broke, we can't even do lottery payouts, right? But here's the thing. What they have maintained spending for is incarceration, right? That's remained constant, right? And we see that schools in places like Chicago have been disinvested, right? And that shift in those spaces are ones that we have to pay attention to. We're in this beautiful building, but I'm more in being here for the first time. The first question that I would ask is, who are the people who live in this vicinity? Because see, here in Seattle, you all have gone to this neighborhood schools piece. And the question about that neighborhood schools is, who is included, who is excluded, and under what terms, right? And when we don't pay attention to that, then we do more of the same. So now we're under, and I want to recognize you all's plight as teachers. You all are dealing with all types of madness, from the Common Core to whatever garbage Pearson got cracking to whatever, right? And let's call it what it is. All that shit that Pearson is pushing is a putrid turd. It's garbage, right? Let's name it. A test is going to tell you nothing about the capacity of your young folks to learn, right? Now, here's the thing. According to the psychometricians that write the test, the only thing a test tests is how well you take a test on a particular day. Now, in Chicago, we engage in torture in testing. Tell you how we do it. We get the little ones, and we give them the test, and then we give them these dry cookies with nothing to drink. So you done gave the babies a test, and you choking them. Right? So, I mean, this thing, I mean, and what's the rationale? And we got schools in Chicago that are delivering 60 to 100 assessments per week. Right? So what kind of learning is happening there? Right? And what do young folks do because they're smart? Reject this thing that we're telling them is so good. Right? So we have to redefine our commitment to education, because what we actually are reifying now is school. And regular school has done little to nothing for the last 200 plus years. Right? Because when we look at our education, let's do a straw poll, and I'm glad the camera is on for this. By a show of hands, how many folks would say that they learned the majority of what they needed in life outside of school? Then what are we doing? What is happening? If y'all can name that, what are we doing? Right? We're just in this kind of state form compliance. Right? Rewarded, because we know the piece. You're rewarded for being quiet. You're rewarded for staying in line. You're rewarded for turning in the paper that's halfway legible. Right? Because as a teacher, we're programmed to be like, all right, look, I can read it. Okay, yeah. Right? So now when we break from that, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going to come up. So if we're talking about entering race and our conversation of racism, we got to name what this thing is. The continued legacy of white supremacy. Right? And when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm not talking about Dylan Roof. I'm not talking about somebody who goes into a church and shoots 9 innocent people. I'm talking about a belief, a value system that says the views of Western European hetero white men are normal, right, and good, and that everything else is deviant. Right? We have to embrace that. Right? And let me say this to end our dehumanization. People, when there is something that you do not know, do not begin with this. Can I ask you a question? Don't begin with that. Because what that really is saying is, can I ask a question that will potentially dehumanize you and further the legacy of white supremacy? What you can say is, there's some things that I do not know and I am trying to understand. And in my understanding, did I get this right? And what did I get wrong? And what is the road to improvement? Now, think about that when you ask your students that, right? Think about if your evaluators were not Pearson, but your students. How would you begin to feel about teaching? Because I don't want to lie to you all. When you engage in this type of work, it is never an issue of if they are coming. It is when they are coming, right? So I always crack this joke with my students, like, look, when the feds come, just remember we on page 48 and I'll be right back, right? And if I'm not back in 3 hours, y'all know who to call, right? So this thing around constantly being aware of that, because a lot of times this stuff that we don't know continues to dehumanize us, right? So in my own space, right, I've had to learn a lot about the transgender community, right? And be intentional about that. And first be intentional about all the things I don't know, right? And to ask questions of folks, but not questions that are dehumanizing, but asking questions because people have been isolated in particular ways, right? This is all the way down to all of this gross out stuff, and you all are a little more progressive here in Seattle. But if you go down to Texas, this is all this gross out stuff with abstinence education. Guess what, y'all? If you got high schoolers, they are probably thinking about each other in very intimate ways. Just real talk. And as adults, we like forget that, right? We forget that we were high schools. We forget that somebody told us that they liked us and the rose appeared above our heads and we're walking around all day with the inkling that someone liked us, right? So all this stuff about gross out, yeah, you show them a picture of chlamydia. Ugh. Is that going to stop what's happening? No. You're going to show them a picture of herpes. Ugh. No. You better get some kind of distribution in real time. Right? Now, when the parents, and this is always a thing, right? Because schooling has programmed us to be reactionary. So schooling has programmed us to respond to the content. Right? When you say things like genocide, when you say things like slavery, when you say things like repatriation, when you say things like radical, the word radical, right? And I've been deeply educated by a science department. And the science department always says, well, Stovall, you know, radical is a botanical term. And I was like, oh, shit. All right? So one love to the science teachers, right? Because in botany and cancer research, when you talk about a radical growth, you're talking about a growth from the source, right? And I'm using the hell out of that, right? So when we talk about a radical imaginary, right? This radical imaginary is actually challenging us to think about the way reality is. Now, also in the radical imaginary is the commitment to change that reality. Now, you cannot do that by yourself, because that's always the false bullshit Hollywood story that we get, right? Freedom writers or whatever garbage Hollywood puts out, right? That person's just gonna come in and just, yes, young person of color, just right. Are you kidding me? Like what happens in those classrooms? And see, we are very reluctant to talk about those bad days of teaching. Right? Them days when you got the homicidal thoughts. Right? Those bad days where you're just like, man, it's just not going right. Right? Whatever you do, it's just not going right. right? And for you all, you first year teachers, so when this island happens, find the homies. Find the people that you trust. These are the people who will keep you alive in this, right? Because it's, again, right? Because we have to confront realities, right? So in the radical imaginary, we have to be clear that there has been an increasing rate of suicide amongst teachers, right? And we also have to be clear that one of the things that happens in teaching and why people leave teaching is a sense of isolation. Not a bad administrator and not the young folks. The number one reason is folks feeling this sense of isolation, right? So if you are in a schoolhouse and you see that young teacher struggling, scoop them up, talk to them, because it's just like our young folks who have not been heard. Right? Y'all have had this experience, right? You talk to a young person who hasn't been talked to, they just gonna talk. Right? You gotta set up that you can just listen to them, right? It's just, right? And you gotta take it, you just gotta take it, right? You just there. It's like perpetual set of jabs, all right? You just taking it. But in the same light, now what the responsibility is, now that demonstrates that they are trusting of you. That trust is precious. That trust must be honed into issues and concerns that are relevant to their lives. Now, when you operate in that way, it changes up planning. It changes up how you understand curriculum. It changes up your discussion of the forces that actually deeply impact your day-to-day. Right? So as somebody in Chicago, I can't do that without an explicit understanding of racism. You all should not be doing this in the Pacific Northwest without an explicit understanding of systemic and structural racism, especially in a place like Seattle where nobody can afford to buy a house to live. Right? Right? I mean, people are being priced out, and all you got to do is look at the lesson of San Francisco. San Francisco is a childless city. Right? There are more registered dogs than school-age young people in San Francisco. Right? Not Stovall's conjecture, check the data. Right? So if you all are moving towards that. Right? So as you push young folks and families further out, you just gonna have the Microsoft bust. Right? The Microsoft bus. Right? I almost got wrecked by the Google bus in San Francisco. I heard y'all got the Microsoft bus. Right? And now this thing around people not having spaces to live, because what do we know is one of the top stressors for young folks and families? Moving. So if you got high mobility rates in your school, those are deep stressors, right? And how do we now represent or actually address those stressors on the front end? Not running away from them. Because when we run away from them, we justify the issue and concern, right? You all are starting to get the first push of this, right? So now, and I'm starting to see this, right? So charter schools will go right next to the neighborhood school and drain the neighborhood school of its population. Then that neighborhood school is declared underutilized. And that charter moves right in. Same population of young folks. And this is the thing, the rub on charters, right? Very few charters have provisions for young folks with special needs or English language learners. Got to be clear about that, right? The same thing with this Common Core. Very few provisions for English language learners, very few provisions for folks who may have special needs. And how does this play itself out? What are we seeing? What are the tangible interruptions? Well, one of those tangible interruptions is you all being able to collectivize your efforts, right? That's critical. And at the same time, being very explicit about the conditions of the school and your students. And let me interrupt this trope. I don't want anyone in teaching, I tell my students this all the time. For the young folks who are the Washington recruiting teachers, here's the thing. I don't want anybody going to a community saying that they are there to help. We do not need missionaries, because if we look at the history of missionaries, we see what that led to. But what we are looking for is people to act in solidarity with young folks, right? And being very clear. So we can even use our teacher language. It's a vocabulary word. Solidarity, meaning that we always won't agree, but there is a commitment to justice. And in that commitment, we are willing to support each other in that search for justice. Because too many times, and teacher ed is terrible about this, right? Teacher ed does this stuff that you go into a college of ed and everybody's talking about pedagogy and no one knows what the hell it is. What, I mean, how do you do that? Right, and then folks say, well, pedagogically speaking, what the? It's like, come on, y'all. But this thing around understanding these spaces, and because we have that particular commitment to solidarity, it is a commitment to acknowledge the things we do not know. So if we're talking about entering the conversation about race, and everybody gets slick now. So Glenn Singleton, who's in the Bay Area, everybody got a Courageous Conversations book. Right? And people like pull it out like a shotgun, right? Stoffel, I got it. Y'all ain't even listen to Glenn. Because what Glenn is saying is that's the first part of the conversation. That's only the first part of the conversation. We're talking about a different commitment. We're talking about recognizing, because see, people get slick to it with it also, right? They say, well, we want to recognize our white privilege. I want us to recognize how white supremacy has deeply impacted the trajectory of this thing we call the United States. Right? I don't want to run from that, right? Because it's not an attack on white people, right? It's an attack on a system that has declared certain populations disposable. So if we are ending the politics of disposability, there's a different commitment there. There's stuff you got to do that you may not be prepared to do at first, that you have to build with others to figure out what this thing is. Right? So again, in closing, I come to you all as someone who is struggling with this. I come to you all from a hyper-segregated city where black and brown bodies are in the afterlife of slavery and have been declared disposable. I am working with a group of folks to end that dynamic. So some of you all saw the 34-day hunger strike that went on in Chicago, where people risked life and limb, right? And at the end of the hunger strike, to show you their commitment, at the end of the hunger strike, the medical team told a couple of the hunger strikers, you're on the edge. Their response to the medical team said, well, that's what it is. We did it for freedom. So if I can actually channel their commitment to do this work in a way that makes sense, in a way that is responsible, in a way that recognizes the legacy and terror of white supremacy, and to work with others to interrupt it, then I've halfway done my job, and I hope to do more. Thank y'all.